Terrariums, especially the really big ones, are often really hard to find, and when you do find them, they're often pretty expensive. But they don't have to be. I've been making my own tanks for almost 4 years now, and in this video I'll show you that it is easier and cheaper than you might imagine. Now for this demonstration we'll be making 2 terrariums, this big horizontal one with sliding doors for my bearded dragon, and this vertical one with a door that swings open for my Crested Gecko. But the sky is the limit. Both of these designs can easily be scaled up or down to whatever dimensions you need. Now let's get to work. For this project you're gonna need some tools. Bare minimum you will need a drill. And that's it. A saw is not necessary for this project, but having your own does make it a whole lot easier. Most hardware stores offer a service where they can cut the wood for you, so if you go in prepared, a saw isn't really necessary. That said, I did use a circular saw and a miter saw throughout this project to cut the wood myself. And then there's a couple of other tools I've used for small details, but all of those are optional steps where if you don't really feel like doing it, you could skip it and work around it. Now with that out of the way, let's get started. The first thing I did was cut the panels. I'm using OSB here, but you can just as easily use plywood. The reason I'm using OSB is because it's a lot cheaper and I'm going to cover it all up later, so I don't really care how it looks. I'm using 18mm thick panels for the larger tank and 9mm thick for the smaller tank. Looking back, I think 9mm is just slightly too thin and I'd recommend going for at least 11mm. Both of these tanks have a design where the bottom panel will be surrounded by the side panels. So if you need a specific width for your tank, you need to subtract the thickness of the wood from your measurements of the bottom panel. For the smaller tank, I first built a little frame with some boards and attached the bottom panel to it. This little frame will give us a little bit more space for our glues and our screws and make the whole build a lot easier. Next I glued and screwed the side panels in place and made another little wooden frame. This one will be attached at the top of the tank. And while I'm adding the glue for the back panel, you can get a clear view of how this design works. There's a wooden frame all the way at the top and all the way at the bottom of this tank, and all the panels will be attached to these frames, making it very quick and easy to make a nice square box. You do have to make sure that the side panels are slightly wider than the frames that you're building, so that the back panel can be installed in between the side panels. The hardest part here is adding screws through the side panels into the back panel. Since it's only 9mm thick, you need to be sure you're screwing them in straight or they'll poke out the back. This is why I recommend using slightly thicker wood. On a side note, I'm not showing it much in this video, but throughout this project I'm adding a lot of screws, but before I'm attaching any screws, I'm pre-drilling all of the holes. It's gonna be very redundant to keep saying it, so from here on out just assume that all the holes are pre-drilled. Now for the bigger tank the design is similar but slightly different. First off, I decided that this bigger one could do with some side ventilation, which is an optional step you can take, and it depends on what kind of environment you wish to recreate inside the tank. I first measured where I want the ventilation to be and drilled some holes in the opposing corners. I then cut the hole using a jigsaw, making sure to stay inside the lines, and then work my way towards my marks using a file. If you don't own a jigsaw, you could drill holes all along the inside of your marks and clean up the edge using a file. Anyway, I ended up deciding that I don't want to see the edge of the OSB on the finished product, so I cut up some small boards to size to create a sort of frame on the inside there. Again, this is totally optional, but I really like it. Next, I also want to cover up the OSB using a thin piece of plywood. I'm using a copying bit in my trim router to get an exact match really easily and really quick. This is also an optional step, and you could also make this panel without using a trim router but just measuring everything and cutting it with any other kind of saw. But I do have the tools available to make this a quick and easy task, so I decided to just use my trim router. And if you don't plan on using side ventilation, you could skip this step altogether and just use plywood for the sides of your tank. Anyway, I'll put the plywood covers to the side for now and start assembling the tank. In contrast to the smaller tank, I'm not gonna make a frame first, but instead will attach these panels directly together. I marked the back panels for the thickness of the wood, so I knew where to attach the screws. I then added glue to the bottom panel and screwed the two together. I then went back to add more screws for a more secure fit. The distance between the screws varies a bit from project to project, but I generally add screws every 5 to 10 centimeters, depending on whether it will have a water feature or not. Next, I attached the side panels. To secure these, I first added 4 screws, and then I checked to make sure the inside corner was still 90 degrees, and then added more screws. Once all the glue dried, I stapled aluminium window screen mesh over the ventilation holes and glued the thin plywood panel over the sides. Now I prefer not to have any screws visible from the front of the tank, which is why I added a board on the inside of the tank. This one was attached from the bottom. Next, I made a frame for the top of the tank and decided I was gonna be fancy with my trim router to get a slightly cleaner look out of this. Again, this is totally optional, you could just attach the top frame like we did on the smaller tank, but I thought it looked really nice. Now the board at the bottom alongside the frame at the top will make it possible to attach the front of the tank without having any screws visible. I simply cut a couple boards to length and added some glues and screwed them in place from the inside of the tank. This way the board is neatly secured without having any screws visible. Now if you don't feel like doing this or you don't mind having screws at the front of your tank, you could always just add the screws from the outside in and skip the board on the inside altogether. As for the sides of the frame, I didn't have any elaborate plan to hide the screws and instead just simply only used glue to hold them in place. This was slightly different on the smaller tank, since in this design the sides of the frame will experience a bit more force. So to ensure their longevity, I attached all of the pieces that will make up the front of the tank together using dowels. And if you feel like this is above your skill level, you could easily just make the entire front out of a panel of plywood and cut an opening in the middle. Anyway, once the frame was completed, I attached it to the tank using glue and screws from the inside, just like on the big one. The next day, once everything dried, I heavily sanded both tanks. This is the moment where if you've slightly misaligned pieces on the front of your tank, you can sand everything smooth, which in fact is exactly what happened on my build. Now we're making great progress, and if you're making a tank with sliding doors, all the woodworking is now done. And if you're enjoying this video so far, do me a favor and subscribe to the channel so you won't miss it when I escape these enclosures. Alright, it is time to seal our tanks, and for that you basically have two options. You could use liquid rubber or epoxy resin. Now both of these products can be used to create an animal safe watertight seal in your tank, but there's a few small differences. First, you have the liquid rubber. This stuff is slightly cheaper than the epoxy resin. It's also easier to apply. You can use it straight out of the box and apply it like a paint, but once it is dry, it does remain somewhat sticky, and I found that silicone has a pretty hard time sticking to this stuff. On the other hand, you have epoxy resin. This stuff is a bit more expensive and a bit more difficult to use. You need to measure it out in a certain ratio, mix it together, and then you can apply it. Still, I wouldn't really call it hard to apply, but you need to be careful of what you're doing. But once applied, it does dry rock solid, and silicone has no problem sticking to it at all. So there's pros and cons to both of them. They will both work fine. Generally, I lean towards epoxy resin when I'm making a bigger tank, or if the tank is going to include a water feature. Now, something that I'll do regardless of which sealant I use is apply multiple layers, and in the second layer I will always apply a seam tape. And the reason that I do this in the second layer is so that in the first layer, if there's any cracks or voids along your seams, they first get flooded with a sealant, hopefully fill all the way up, and remove any of the
possible leaks there, and then the second layer gets the seam tape, greatly increasing the strength of the seams, and that way you hopefully don't have a leak on your first go.
And while I've been sealing these tanks, you may have noticed that I already stained a bigger tank. I did this before sealing so I could make the areas around the ventilation holes match the outside of the tank. Next, we need to address the top of the tanks. You will need to include a screen one way or another. And you could do what I did here and staple the screen directly to the top of the tank. Or you could build some sort of frame and then attach the screen to the frame and then the frame to the tank. And you can just use whatever option works best for you. Once the screen was in place, I covered the edges with more liquid rubber, painted the sides of the tank black to seal them, and stained the front of the tank to match my other tanks. The only thing remaining at this point is adding doors. For the big tank I went with sliding doors. This process is fairly simple. I just siliconed the glass tracks in place, waited for them to dry, and then added the glass panels. I ordered these panels to match the exact size of my tank, and the height of these panels should be slightly less than the height of the opening without the glass tracks. The exact size depends on the type of glass track you're using, and in my case I needed to make sure the panels are 9 mm shorter than the opening of the tank. The door for the vertical tank is a little bit more involved, but definitely doable. I first cut these pieces so the inside dimension of the frame will match those of the opening in the tank. Next we will need to create a channel for the glass to rest in. Now I've used a circular saw in the past to create these channels, but this is quite hard to pull off and not really the safest option. If you own a table saw you could use that to create these channels, but I'll be using a trim router. Then I also added a 45-degree detail along the outside of the door and added 2 indentations for the hinges. Both of these aren't necessary at all, but I think they make for a much cleaner look. So I moved the tank upstairs into the animal room. It is in the stand it will be in. It is just a really simple stand with a piece of wood on the side to make it look a little bit better, and up top we have a really simple wooden board with little eyes, and then there's hooks here, and then as we put everything together it looks pretty seamless, it looks really good. Now next up will be installing the door. We have the frame right here, there's no glass in there just yet, we'll do that in a minute. But for now I taped the corners together with some masking tape, and I've already installed the hinges. And now I'm just gonna hold this over the opening of the tank just to see how it lines up. This will be fine. So next I'll be getting some more masking tape and holding this in place. So, and then we can attach the top and the bottom. Okay, just to be sure that we're all on the same page here, the goal here was to find the correct placement of the hinges. And I thought it would be easier to do this before we complete the door, because it would be bigger and heavier. And yeah, it kind of was. Aligning the door correctly isn't that hard, but I wanted to try this out to try and find an easier way of installing a door. And you know what? It is easier this way. But since we still need to complete the door, we need to unscrew the hinges. Now I'm gonna use some wood glue in the corners to attach the piece of wood together, and I'm gonna fill up the channels with silicone to hold the glass in place. Now I'm not great at creating clean silicone beads, so I like to use masking tape to make it a bit easier. That said, I still got a bit of a smudge, but we can fix that later. The next day everything dried, or at least dried enough, so we could install the door. And at this point we can remove any unwanted silicone with a sharp razor blade. Now to keep the door closed I want to try using magnets. I got a couple of these really strong neodymium magnets that will be perfect for the job. I drilled a couple of small matching holes on the door and the tank itself and glued the magnets in place using fast set epoxy. I thought one in each corner would do, but ended up doubting if that was strong enough and decided to add a couple more in the middle.
Now that is much better. But if you're not really confident using magnets, you could do what I did in the past and use some of these sliding locks. Now you may have noticed that in the animal room these tanks look slightly different than when we were making them, and that has to do with the stand that I placed them in. Now the stand is optional. I really like making stands. It is really easy, and in fact I'll link up a video down in the description of when I made this stand. It's really nice. It includes these wooden boards that help me hide the lights while still keeping them accessible. But if you don't really feel like building a stand, don't worry, these tanks, these designs, they will work just fine if you just put the lights up on the screen and not have any stand at all. It's optional, but I really like it. But I have to admit, my hands are itching to finally start scaping my Crested Gecko tank. So if you're wondering how this one will turn out, I recommend you watch this video next. I'll see you there.